you getting ready for a coding interview? Or maybe you just had one that didn't go as planned? Well, I want to share some of my thoughts with you in this video. If you've never seen me before, then hi, my name is Gwen. I've had experience working as both a tech lead and a hiring manager in a management position. And over the last almost 9 years, I've been through many rounds of interviews at various types of companies. At my last role, I was actually able to set up and manage the hiring process. So I have a bit of a unique perspective that maybe you haven't heard before from both the side of being an interviewer and the side of being an interviewee. I just wanted to drop this video really to give some insight into the process for you, as well as be some motivation and hopefully encouragement for you if you're going through this process. First, I want to start with some things that are really common misconceptions about the interview process and different types of interviews. And I hope that these points that I'm going to make can help to squash some misconceptions that I think lead to negative thoughts or self-doubt in a lot of people going through this process. So I think the first thing that you need to understand going through an interview process is that companies are optimizing the whole process to reduce false positives. So what does that mean? They basically don't want to make a bad hire because it can be so costly and so detrimental for the team and for the company that they will try to avoid that at all costs. Now, if they're optimizing to reduce false positives to zero if possible, they actually will end up rejecting a lot of very good candidates who could have done well in the role. And that is kind of a false negative, right? So they take a candidate into the interview process, but then for whatever reason, they end up rejecting them at some point, saying, oh, they're not a good fit, when actually they may have been a very good fit. But the interview process isn't able to, of course, 100% objectively determine who is a good fit and who is not a good fit. So they have to err on the side of caution for the sake of the company and try to, what some people call, hire slowly. There's an expression in the industry, I think, hire slow and fire fast. Just because you get rejected, it doesn't mean you were a bad candidate, and it doesn't mean you wouldn't have really excelled in that role. Lots of people get rejected that are great, right? For whatever reason, they didn't meet the company's expectations, or there was a better candidate in the interview process. So you really can't be emotionally invested in a company until you receive the offer letter and you start your first day of work, because you never really know what's going to happen in the interview process. One more point I want to make along those lines is that the technical interview, so the coding challenge or whatever type of technical interview the company is doing, is not a reflection on how well you will actually do at the company necessarily. So, for example, I was thinking about this because I was talking to an acquaintance of mine who's been my mentor for a while, and he basically had this job at a large tech company, kind of a FANG level company. And he was telling me that if he had gone through the front door, meaning their regular interview process, he doesn't think that he would have gotten the job. But because he worked for a company that was acquired by this bigger company, he was able to start working there, and he's even excelled and been promoted, I think, at least 2 or 3 times since he started working at the bigger company. But he only got hired there because his company was acquired, not because he made it through the interview process. If he had directly applied and gotten rejected, that large company would have missed out on a great candidate that has done a lot and provided a lot of value in that role. All that to say is that you can't let the coding challenge or some kind of hard technical interview get you down or accept it as the entirety of your value working in the tech industry. Another thing that I think especially introverts seem to face is this kind of pendulum or up and down. Like they do really well on one interview and then totally bomb the next interview. And some of it is determined by their level of anxiety in that type of interview or in that moment. And I think it really stings when, they know they could have done better. I've felt that before, gone through an interview where I didn't do as well. And after the interview, I'm like, I know I could have done so much better if I had done this or that. Or sometimes even I had done the exact same, almost the same interview a few weeks before, or months before, a year before, whatever, and crushed it. And then come to this interview and totally bombed it. So I think everybody has those ups and downs. I've seen, a really great developer, someone I've really looked up to, their coworkers talk about how awesome they are, but they go into an interview and they get anxiety and they totally bomb the interview. So they didn't end up getting the role at that company just because of how they presented themselves in that moment. So I'm not blaming the company because the company obviously needs some kind of interview process and has to screen people. And there's, no perfect solution for the company, right? I'm just mentioning this because a lot of developers, especially now with all the layoffs, I see a lot of people getting depressed or feeling hopeless or being very, very stressed in their job search. So I'm just sharing these points more for the interviewee. And then the last thing I want to say here in this section is that sometimes you do really, really well and the company just chooses somebody else. But it's not necessarily a reflection of you as the candidate. Even when I was managing hiring, sometimes it was a really difficult decision and there were many great candidates, many people that I thought I would love to work with that person, but it comes down to so many factors, including factors on the company side and the people side and the skill set of that individual person and what the company needs at this particular moment. There's just so many factors that go into it. Sometimes it's also not the company turning you down, but you realizing things about the company as you go through the interview process. And then by the end, maybe you get an offer that you have to turn down because it wasn't what you expected the whole time. And you feel like you wasted so many hours. So that can also be really frustrating. Now I want to talk a little bit about, specifically coding interviews. So people have been saying since I first started studying development, I don't know how many years ago. I think I took my first real coding class in 2007. And then I started studying coding every single day and getting really into it the end of 2014. And I've been hearing this whole time that, the coding interview is broken. So what I'm going to say is nothing new to anybody, but I'm just adding my perspective here. I kind of mentioned this before, but the coding challenge really isn't necessarily, or most of the time, an accurate reflection of how well you will do at the company. It's easy to send somebody a timed coding challenge and use that as a screening mechanism. You have 30 minutes or however long, finish this coding challenge, and then we'll review the quality of your code. Unfortunately, that is not a very good way to test for a lot of important characteristics about a person, like grit, motivation, and ability to learn. These are all critical things that you want to look for in someone you're hiring, but you can't really see that through a technical challenge. Of course, we need to screen people technically because it's a technical role. However, most of the coding challenges that I've seen or experienced don't necessarily directly correlate to how well I will do technically at the job. That's why many times it's a separate type of studying a developer needs to do for an interview versus the studying and learning they have to do to be able to perform on the job. Of course, some companies are trying to change this and try out different solutions, different types of problems to make it more practical and to also make it more comfortable for different types of personalities who are interviewing. The problem is that it's just not that easy. It's not that easy, and there's no way to set up a perfect interview system that can accommodate everybody. From the perspective of a hiring manager, it's extremely difficult to gauge whether a person is both the right fit for the company and the company is the right fit for the person at that particular time in their life. I'll give you an example. One job posting that I posted, within a few days, I think I had maybe 300 or so applicants. There was a lot, right? So I had to shut it off. And then try to filter it down to maybe the top 10 to 15 candidates that I could more thoroughly, search through and screen. And then from those, I would scrutinize kind of everything in their experience, their social media, anything else I could find about that person. By social media, most of it was LinkedIn and GitHub. They're like professional and coding related online presence. And then I would take the candidates, the remaining, maybe let's say 5 or 6 candidates. Then I would invite them for a screening call, spend 15 to 30 minutes asking them questions and also telling them about the company to see if the role was a good fit for us and for them. And then, of course, from there, take them through the rest of the interview process, through a technical interview, meeting the team, et cetera, and leading up to potentially an offer. During this process, especially from candidates that we turned down, I got various emails about feedback and people telling me why different types of coding assessments did or did not work for them. We initially had a system where people could take a few hours and build an app or add some features to an application that we made internally, and we would pay them for their time because it did take like maybe 3 or 4 hours. So some people liked that system and did well, and other people said it was really grueling and stressful. And it was really hard to come up with the perfect solution for technical interviews. So then we ended up outsourcing it to another company that specialized in technical interviews. And with this company, it would send the interviewee, I think, three different challenges. They were all anywhere from maybe 35 minutes to an hour. And cumulative, it would end up being a little over 2 hours to complete all 3. And again, there were some candidates who went through this process and really liked it, that they liked how practical it was. And then there were other candidates that said having a timer gave them a lot of anxiety. They felt like they didn't do as well as they could have. And sometimes I felt like candidates on both sides of that would be good fits and were technically competent. But one of them, did better on the technical interview than the other one. So when I am pitching it or pitching a certain hire to upper management, like the CEO, or trying to defend my reason for hiring somebody or wanting to hire somebody, it's really hard for me to say that, okay, this person is going to be the better choice because they have grit, they have motivation, they are always trying to learn and improve, they're a great personality fit on the team, and they have good references, but they didn't do as well on the technical interview. I think because the technical interview has a certain score, that really can't be disregarded in the interview process, no matter how well you do on the other interview steps. So really, you can't feel hurt if, or feel bad about yourself if you think you did really well and made a connection, but the hiring manager still doesn't pick you, because sometimes there's a lot going on behind the scenes that you can't see at the company. Sometimes you think it's, only the hiring manager's decision, but actually the hiring manager usually has to sell you or sell hiring you to maybe other stakeholders, influential developers, upper level management, or other people at the company. And sometimes those people, look at you as a potential hire from the perspective of how you look on paper and your score on a coding assessment. They have not seen all the additional context that the team and the hiring manager have seen about you. But they could also be decision makers that accept or reject you just based off of how you are on paper. Sometimes I really wanted to hire someone that I thought would have been really great, but I couldn't hire them because it was turned down by somebody else at the company. So I'm just saying all that to let you know, or to remind you that you don't really know what's going on behind the scenes at a company ever. I recently went through an interview process with a company. Well, it was a little while ago, but anyway, I went through this interview process and I actually got to the stage where they said, we're going to give you an offer. And I thought the whole interview process went really well. And I had actually studied up on the technologies I was going to use at the role and all of the things I was going to do in that engineering department. And I was really, really excited about the company and the position. But then things got, I guess I could only describe it as a little bit weird at the end. So I had a final follow-up chat with the hiring decision maker for that role, because I would basically be leading the engineering department. They wanted to move their engineering team to being internal instead of just having external contractors and build a new SaaS platform. So I was really excited about getting that opportunity. And they said they were going to make me an offer. I thought everything was all set. And then they kept saying, oh, I'll get back to you tomorrow. And then it was Monday, and then it was next week. I started to think like, okay, maybe they're not actually hiring for the role, or there's some kind of internal trouble going on. So at some point it felt like they're just playing games with me. They interviewed me for this role, told me I was going to get an offer on this date. They kept pushing it back. And eventually I just couldn't trust the company anymore because I had no idea what kind of internal turmoil or whatever was going on there. But for me, at first it felt really disappointing because I really, really wanted to work there. And it made me kind of, I guess, give up on interviewing for a little while. But I'm just sharing that example because, again, you never really know what's going on at a company until you get the offer letter and start work. Sometimes it could be as simple as you do really well, but other candidates are doing really well. Also, of course, they should never say, like, we're going to give you an offer, but then they never give you the offer. If they want to move forward with other candidates, then it would probably be the right thing to do to reject you if it's their intention to not hire you, of course. They could also be interviewing you as kind of a backup plan. So maybe they have someone already working at the company who wants to move roles that is probably going to get that position, or someone referred by an internal employee, then it's likely they will get the position, but maybe you're just the backup plan or the just in case person if things don't work out with the other candidate or the preferred candidate. Those are just a bunch of thoughts that I have about interviews and why interviews might not necessarily be a reflection of how good the candidate is. Because again, interviews are optimized to avoid false positives at all costs. So now I want to give some of my thoughts about the different types of interviews and how to prepare for them. Let me start with the most obvious one, which is the typical standard coding interview. So a lot of companies send you some type of coding challenge. A lot of people call these the LEET code style algorithm challenges. And you have to solve some kind of algorithm. Usually I see companies give you 2 challenges at once, at least 2. One of them will be kind of an easier problem or a warm-up, and the second one, or if there's 3, maybe the third one, will be some kind of harder problem, maybe a matrix problem or a graph or something like that. And you're timed, so you have to complete it in a specific amount of time. Usually these types of interviews are not live, like a company will send it to you as a screening challenge. Some companies do these live, and that's actually what I prefer because it's very hard and I think sometimes intimidating for someone to just get this algorithm challenge that they've never seen before. It's not really what they do in their day-to-day work. Then have, a timer counting down from 30 minutes or whatever. You have to finish this challenge and read through all this word problem, understand it, and come up with a solution in a short amount of time. And not only that, the company wants you to optimize the solution and clean up the code and all those other things. So if you take 5 to 10 minutes to understand the problem and then plan it, and then you have a little bit of time to actually implement the problem and iterate and debug, and then you have a couple minutes at the end to clean up. And a lot of times you run out of time, especially in the harder challenges. So one reason why I really dislike the challenges that aren't given to you live is because it's hard to determine how knowledgeable somebody is from a challenge that isn't live, or even if they really did the challenge at all themselves. AI could have done it, or maybe they outsourced it to somebody else or something like that, because you just can't assess, the nuances of how they approach the challenge or how they think or really their aptitude about solving the problem at all if it's just an impersonal coding challenge. And I think some people will disagree with me there, but I've done quite a few interviews. I've been a part of quite a few interviews. I've talked to a lot of other interviewers, especially when I was trying to get better. And I really think there's no good way to tell someone's technical skills without giving them some kind of live assessment or reviewing the assessment that you sent them live after the fact. When you interview a candidate live, you can really see how they work, how they think through a problem and try to solve it. And I think that paints a much clearer picture of how well they will do at the company versus just looking at their, raw code that they wrote in some very impersonal challenge that you asynchronously sent them. So that's the first type of coding interview. And I would say that type is somewhat the least helpful type of technical interview that a company can send somebody. I mostly dislike algorithm challenges that don't reflect what somebody is doing in their day-to-day work, and especially the ones that are sent impersonally to somebody. I don't think it paints a clear picture of how well they will do at a company at all. The second type, I would say, is a hands-on coding challenge. Now, there are a lot of assessment tools and companies that have been trying to make coding interviews more practical, especially over the last so many years. So these challenges will try to have you build maybe a real small application or add features to a current application or debug a couple things in a current application or any combination of all of the above. Sometimes this is done in an interview that is live and sometimes it's not live. I think this seems to vary widely from company to company, but I think it is a much better judge of how someone will do at work, even though it's not perfect. a lot of it determines on the type of challenge you are giving to the person. For example, it has to be relevant to your industry and the type of role that they will be performing. For example, and this is a very common example, is that you are, let's say you're a front-end developer, you go into an interview and they give you a game design challenge, kind of, build this game in this many hours or implement game logic. And it's really, well, some people consider it kind of offensive that I'm applying for this type of role, but you're giving me a game design challenge that has nothing to do with the role that I'm going to be performing at your company. So I wouldn't say it's offensive, but I have seen a lot of pushback on those types of questions. I have seen some good candidates actually completely stop the interview process because they received a game design challenge and said, okay, I'm just not working for this company. This isn't serious. They're asking me to design a game, but that's not what I do, and that's not what I'm going to do at the company, so it doesn't really make any sense. So I think that this type of challenge can be very practical, but it all comes down to how it's implemented. A couple thoughts I have about this type of challenge is, one, that I think if someone gets to this point, past screening and to this practical technical challenge, I think you can send it to a candidate, but I think it's always fair and good to go through the challenge live with them after, because that's the only way that you're going to really be able to see how well they understand things and get to know their thought process, again, versus just, reading it on the screen. The second thing is that when companies are sending these kind of practical, build this thing or this feature challenges to candidates, a lot of times I've seen those challenges take candidates upwards of 5 or 10 hours. Sometimes they even spend 20 or more hours working on that challenge. And I don't really think that's fair to ask for that much time from a candidate if you're not paying them. So I think to make it more fair, you can, of course, pay them. You could also use a platform that tries to do this in a time limit. So give the candidate a certain amount of time. That way it's time boxed to an hour or two, or, maybe not 3, but probably less than 3 hours. So it makes it more fair for every candidate versus one candidate taking, 2 hours because they have a job and a family or whatever, and another candidate takes 20, 30 hours because they're unemployed and they just have a lot more time to spend on it. Then, of course, the second candidate will do much better on the interview challenge, even though maybe the first candidate would have been the much better pick overall. That's just one attempt to add fairness. Of course, the interview process will not be 100% fair for every candidate. A third type of interview or technical interview that I've been seeing more and more of, especially over the last maybe 3-4 years, is a code review challenge. And I really, really like this type of interview because it's very practical. It's something that, I do almost every day, at least several times a week. I'm reviewing other people's code at work. And I think this type of challenge really helps you see how well a candidate can do jumping into another code base. And even if you don't know the framework or language, if you're a certain level of developer, you should be able to pick out, okay, this is how it's organized. It takes a few minutes to adapt and kind of figure things out. But if it's organized in a standard way, you can usually pick out okay, this is where the logic is. And so you should be able to parse through that, figure out where things are, and then, go through the PR that someone wants to merge in and do the full review process. So I've actually been through this process both on the side of interviewing people, go through the PR review process, and I've also done it in interviews at companies. So a couple times I did an interview that was async, where they used a platform. They would just let me go through the interview process. And the last time that I did a PR interview, it was actually live. I think it was an hour long. No, it was part of an hour long interview where I had one coding challenge for 30 minutes and then the PR review for 20, 30 minutes. So I really enjoy those types of interviews. I think they're very practical. One thing that I think is very helpful if you're going through a PR type interview process is to have a list. Just like many companies have a PR review checklist. So, go through all these steps to review a PR. And even in GitHub or, whatever platform, you can have a checklist to make sure that you reviewed code for, let's say, security concerns, it matches the coding style, that if it's a front-end PR, you compared it with the designs, all these other things. So I think the same thing applies to this PR review interview. And whether it's live or not live, you can always have a checklist next to you of things to check, because that is very real world. If you're in the real world doing a PR, or reviewing someone's PR, probably you're going to have a checklist so you don't forget things. If you do go into an interview, you don't have a checklist or an order, I think the best thing to do is to kind of get comfortable with the organization of the application and what is actually being merged in or what is actually part of the PR, and then just following the data around the application. That can give you a really good idea of what's going on, and you always find a couple bugs or issues or something to point out when you follow the data from the interaction between services or the user interaction from the front end to the back end to the database. You can always find some kind of vulnerability or discrepancy or something missing, and you can be pointing that out in PR comments. Then, of course, there's some obvious things around readability, organization, maybe some bugs or errors. Sometimes in PR review type interviews, you don't get to run the code locally. So you're only looking at the code in the browser, which is not a very practical scenario, because of course, if you are really doing that, you're going to pull the code locally, search through things. You have a much better interface in your local development environment versus just in the GitHub web portal or whatever web portal that the assessment tool is using. One more thing about PR interviews. I know I've been saying a lot because I have a lot of thoughts about this type of interview. But one more thing is that I think sometimes they can be a struggle because you don't really have context about the application before going into the challenge. So I think it's helpful, like I mentioned before, if you get a picture really quick of how the application or whatever you're reviewing is organized first. Another type of interview is, of course, the culture fit interview. So I kind of lump all of the non-technical interviews into this bundle because a lot of it is about culture fit and people in varying roles kind of assessing you and how well you will fit into the company. There are a couple types of these. There's, of course, the initial screening interview, which usually you can get through if you've done your research about the company, you know what they're looking for, you're able to pitch yourself and ask the right questions and also answer questions well from who's ever interviewing you. So I think that's anyway the bare minimum to go into an interview process is looking up the company and who's interviewing you, etc. So there's not too much to say about that type of interview. The bigger culture fit and personal type interviews are when you're talking to the hiring manager or dev manager, and also the team interview. Usually at some point in the process, you'll get to meet the team. Again, there's not too much to say about these types of interviews, except, of course, one, you have to research the company and the person interviewing you. I always take notes, keep a notebook page, digital notebook page in Obsidian on every single company that I interview with. Each person that I interview with or interact with at the company, I take notes about all of them and about the company itself. And up front, I'll make a whole list of questions and things I want to know or things I want to talk about when I'm pitching myself in the interview. Second is, and this really helps people who have anxiety in interviews or introverts, is you really have to practice this type of interview, these type of interpersonal communication, culture fit interviews. Fortunately, there are many groups, both on and offline, where you can practice these types of interviews. I used to run a meetup group, and we would host sessions where we would have volunteers from tech companies in the area, especially hiring managers or people with experience interviewing, come and volunteer their time to interview, potential candidates or developers that wanted to practice their interview skills. Usually they were new developers or junior developers trying to improve. So you can find groups like that. Now, since COVID, of course, more and more of them are online. So I've seen several groups, both free and paid online, doing this type of interview practice. One good place to look is the Free Code Camp forum under, I think it's the careers tag. You can find different people who have asked about interviewing and if someone will help them practice their culture fit interviews. If you can't find anything else, or if you have a preference for doing things in person, I recommend going to your local meetups for whatever language or tool or anything. It doesn't really matter if it's Python, JavaScript, Go, whatever. You can go to one of those meetups, talk to some developers after, and ask, hey, will you help me practice my interviewing one day, or I'll buy you coffee or something like that. You can also pitch it to the meetup host and say, hey, could we do maybe 30 minutes before or after the meetup? We could have, kind of a round robin or, whatever style practice interviews for people. And you could offer to help organize it. And of course, a lot of meetups are volunteer run. So they're always looking for people to help, organize or improve their meetup. And practicing there really helps you to improve your soft skills that you need in the interview process. And mostly it helps people reduce their anxiety when doing those types of interviews. And the more comfortable you feel, usually the better you will do, and the more you can connect with the interviewers and the team. Of course, for practicing technical interviews, I won't go too much into it because there's so many resources online. I have a few of my favorites, so I'm going to just link those in the description below, from using some GitHub practice interview resources to some resources available on Free Code Camp. One of my favorite paid resources is Algo Expert. I've used them in the past, and I just really think they do a great job of taking you through all the steps that you're going to need to prepare for and do well in an interview in all different types of roles now. They have like front end, which I haven't done that one, but I did some in their systems design, and their general data structures and algorithms course is excellent. So I'm sure there's other platforms that are also good. I recently saw that LeetCode also has these pathways that take you through some interview prep, like one is for data structures and algorithms preparation. So I don't really know if that's good or not. A lot of people say good things about LeetCode. I haven't used it in so many years, and I haven't used it really for interview prep, but that's another option. Anyway, I'll link a bunch of stuff in the description below. Before I close, I wanted to share a couple of experiences I've had in interviews over the years as maybe kind of encouragement, I hope. I had one interview, actually, this was kind of recent with a nameless company. I won't say who they are, but I got a coding assessment. I talked to the recruiter at first, and then they sent me this coding assessment, which was 3 parts. It was a little over 2 hours total. And I basically started it when I got back late at night from a trip because I just didn't have that much time in between stuff. And I really wanted to get through this interview process. Actually, I was super excited about this company because I really like what they're doing, what they're building. So anyway, I started the first coding challenge and it was a little bit confusing. So it took me some time to figure out what was going on, what I needed to do. It was a debugging problem. I finished that and then I get to part 2, which I think that was a PR review challenge. And this was it was maybe 1 a.m. already because again, I kind of got back late. And I was actually not going to start that challenge until the next day, but I accidentally hit start. So I was like, oh man, I'm so tired. So anyway, I go through the challenge. I was going really, really slowly and I didn't finish it, but I don't think I did too bad either. It was just okay. And so I did the 3rd challenge and I can't really remember. Oh yeah, I ran out of time in that challenge. It was like 30 minutes or something. But then I took notes about all the things that I was going to do. And I was really close. I was like maybe 2 lines of code away, but I ran out of time. So I didn't have time to finish debugging my last bug. So the timer ended and then I emailed the recruiter and within 30 minutes, so I think it was some kind of automated grading, they sent me my grade, not really a number grade, but kind of feedback on the challenges. And basically they said things like, you should have split out some code into a function, into a named function. And they mentioned a couple other really obvious things like that. And it's like, of course I would have done that, but I ran out of time. It felt like they had graded me on the challenges based off of things that are pretty obvious, like, organize your code, split things out into functions. I can't remember some of the other examples, but oh yeah, one of them was on the last challenge I ran out of time that, only 2 tests passed out of 12, and it's a really low percentage or something like that. So I just thought it was kind of funny because I wrote, in the comments, like, this is what I'm going to do. And obviously I was going to do those things, and I just didn't have enough time in the constraints on the time challenge. So, fair or not fair, the challenges are timed and it doesn't always give an accurate representation of how well you're going to do. And the company ends up emailing me like right after that feedback saying that I didn't do as well as they had hoped on the technical challenge, so won't be moving forward in the interview process, which I know I didn't do as well as I could have done in the interview. Obviously, I probably shouldn't be doing a technical interview at 1 a.m. when I'm super tired and can't think very well. Also, I thought some of the challenge questions were a little confusing, so it actually took me a little while to figure out what was going on, so I wasted some time in the challenge on that. Actually, this is kind of an aside, but I have a screen reader tool called Speechify. Sometimes I have a hard time with comprehension, what I'm reading initially, and especially in this challenge I've never seen before, trying to figure out, what's going on. At first, I felt a little bit frustrated because I was like, I could have done so much better. And I know I would have, excelled at that company. I had so many ideas and things that I wanted to work on there. But it all comes down to, my grade on the technical assessment. And I got points deducted because I, ran out of time and didn't have time to clean up my code. They, gave me the feedback like, oh, you should split your things out into named functions and, all those sorts of things. And that's another reason why I think it's just really nice to do a live interview with someone, because if they had given me a live assessment or even a live review after the coding assessment and gone over everything with me, it would have been, I think, a very different outcome, because obviously I could have talked them through all of the things and they could have asked me questions. I could have, gone back and forth with them. And I think that would have painted a better picture about how well I would have done at the company. But I think after the interview, I realized that a lot of companies just don't want to take the time to do that. Either you pass or you fail. They just want to optimize for getting a bunch of people into the interview pipeline and then screening out candidates who don't do so well, and they don't want their internal employees to take any more time than necessary. Some other examples of interviews that went poorly from earlier on in my career was one interview in particular where I got lost. I frequently get lost. I can't really find my way around very well. So I was going to this interview, which was at a meeting place 4 minutes from my house. And it was at a shopping center that I frequently went to at a Starbucks. For some reason, I just could not find how to get there that day. And I spent 15 minutes driving around. I ended up parking out back and then trying to run through the shopping center to get there. And I ended up being a bit late and very flustered. And then the whole interview, I just couldn't get it together. I was mispronouncing the name the whole time of a mutual acquaintance of ours that I had, with the interviewer. And it was just, the interview was a total train wreck. So I felt really bad about that because I really wanted that job. But then I think it was a week or two later, I did an interview at a similar company and I totally crushed it. And there was really no reason why I couldn't have done the same thing at that company. But I think it was just the day and the circumstance and maybe the person I was interviewing and all of that. So one interview I did really well, and the exact same kind of type of interview about the same thing in a similar role, I just totally bombed. There was another interview I had maybe 5 years ago where I was already working in Python, and I went to this place. They were asking me about some feature of Python that I had actually used quite a bit before. And for some reason, I just couldn't remember. They were grilling me about definitions of things like, what is the definition of OOP and, all this other stuff. And I just couldn't remember certain things or how to use this feature of the language. And from their perspective, it probably seemed like, oh, she doesn't know how to do anything, because it was just me and them basically sitting there in a room. Like, I wasn't coding. It was kind of a technical interview, but I wasn't coding. I wasn't at a grease board or whiteboard. And it was just me having to say the definitions of things and talk about very abstract concepts. And for some reason, I just couldn't remember the definitions, even though I kind of used these things in programs and applications and, things I worked with before. So I remember feeling kind of terrible when I left that interview. But I think later on I realized that that's really a poor interview style. So it didn't have so much to do with me, but grilling someone on, the definition of OOP, I really don't think it's that useful. I'm just giving that as one example, but there were a whole bunch of things. And anyway, I don't think it's that useful versus, more practical, technical interviews that you can do with an interviewee. One thing that's extremely important that I try to always do now after interviews, instead of being emotionally attached to anything, I try to just take it, whether positive or negative, as a learning experience and write out, this is what went well, this is what didn't go well, this is what I can do better next time. So I'm giving myself kind of a self retrospective after each interview so I can improve. And I think that has helped me approach interviews in a much more positive way and not be emotionally attached to the outcome of a specific interview anymore. To conclude this video, I want to say that if you interview at enough companies over the course of your career, you are going to see all sorts of things, right? From crazy things, smaller companies, things you never expected to happen in an interview or hiring process, to really, really tough challenges that you just can't figure out at sometimes larger companies. And really the only thing you can control is how well you prepare for the interview and how you react after the process. So the kind of retrospective. And I think just focusing on those two things really helps you keep a positive mindset in this, job market today and through the interview cycle. And I really believe that if you have the grit to keep going, no matter how many times you're rejected, then eventually you're going to get to the place that you want to be. I hope you learned something from this video. If you have any comments or you think I missed anything, I know I said a lot of words here, but feel free to leave anything additional in the comments below. You can also join my Discord if you want to continue the conversation. There is an opportunities chat in there. Link is in the description below this video. I hope you have a great day. So I hope you have a great week and you do really well in your next interview. And I'll see you in the next video.